homophobia. And so the one enemy that remains is gay people. And the way that gay people are written about in the Christian nationalist movement is not just as, we disagree with gay marriage, or we believe homosexuality is curable. I mean, they write about all these things, but they also write about homosexuality as a giant conspiracy against America. I call the chapter in my book about this the Protocols of the Elders of San Francisco, because that's really what you see in a lot of these books. There's an idea that there's a gay agenda, a homosexual agenda, that its goal is to undermine America at the root, to destroy families, to recruit children, to turn the public schools into sinks of depravity, to really, and they'll write about this as if it is kind of a very organized movement. There's actually a book called The Pink Swastika, which you see sometimes discussed. The writer has been on James Dobson and all the major Christian radio shows, and his book gets referenced. This book, The Pink Swastika, claims that not only were gay people not persecuted by the Nazis, but that idea is part of the homosexual agenda, but that in fact the Nazism was a primarily homosexual movement, and that the gay rights movement is its direct descendant. And so what this means is that it kind of depersonalizes gay people. If this is a ruthless movement that's going to destroy your family and your community and your country, you're justified in being ruthless and fighting it. And so the idea of kind of an individual's rights almost no longer come into play. And I would see in the churches, I was in Ohio in 2004 reporting on the role of churches in the election, among other things. And you would see these sermons that would kind of rouse people to stand up against this ominous, horrific threat. So I remember being in Rod Parsley's church, and Rod Parsley is he's a megachurch pastor. He's also a major political leader in Ohio. He has this huge church on the outskirts of Columbus. I think it has 12,000 members. It's amphitheater, strobe lights, stadium seating. And he's got everyone standing up, and he's talking about, you need to form a mighty army and march on the voting booth, against the homosexuals. And every church I went to, not every church, I went to a Unitarian church that was organizing the opposition, but many of the churches that I went to, that was the first words and the last words out of the preacher's mouth was the homosexuals. And what did this mean in 2004? It meant a couple of things. Not just that it motivated people and got them to the polls, although it did, but it also allowed the churches to function in a political way more than they had before, because churches aren't allowed to stump for, pastors can't stump for candidates from the pulpit. They can't endorse candidates or political parties, but they can get involved in ostensibly nonpartisan issues like gay marriage. And so all these gay marriage issues allowed the churches to move the whole electoral apparatus inside their doors, so that you could have get out the vote, you had your voter registration drives and your get out the vote calls and your phone banking and your petitioning all inside the church walls. And it was really, really effective. If you look at some of the numbers from Ohio, I think it's really unlikely that Bush would have won Ohio without Issue 1, without the anti-gay marriage amendment. I mean, the fact that he doubled his share of the black vote in Ohio has a lot to do with the involvement of conservative African American clergy, and the attempt to kind of unite people on these social issues, despite their disagreements on economic or foreign policy issues. Now, all of this is no accident. I mean, it's something that you don't have to be a conspiracy theorist. This is just how politics works, right? Politics is people getting together and creating a plan to mobilize different constituencies, and that's exactly what they do. When I was writing this book, I got the number for these conference calls that Tony Perkins, who's the head of the Family Research Council, has every month with pastors, in which he quite literally gives them their marching orders from Washington. So I would call in, and these phone calls, these conference calls, they start with prayer, and then Tony Perkins tells the pastors about his latest conversations with the White House, his latest conversations with the congressional leadership, and then what they need to have their congregants do that week. So you need to tell your congregants about this issue, about the filibuster of judicial nominees, or I'm trying to, or about the about the anti-gay marriage constitutional amendment. And then he would say, and you need to write to your senator about that, you need to have them write to their senators about this law or that bill. So you actually have, this kind of very direct degree of coordination in a way that is almost impossible to imagine on the other side, not necessarily because the other side, the other side's a little bit less canny, I think, about these things, but also because I don't think that most liberal believers would want to go to a church on Sunday in which the people who were talking to them were really taking orders from the DNC. So again, what we have is a political movement, kind of in the guise of a religious revival, although clearly it's being spurred by these kind of deep religious existential longings that great numbers of Americans have, and that they're somehow finding some satisfaction for in a movement that creates an imaginary world and promises a kind of glorious national restoration. Now, one of the myths about the Bush administration is that they use their foot soldiers on the Christian right to get elected and then just reward their cronies in business once they get into power. Now, obviously, there have been plenty of rewards, but the kind of Tom Frank hypothesis, and Tom Frank, who wrote What's the Matter with Kansas, is a brilliant guy, and that's a really good book, but I think what he gets wrong in that book is the idea that once the party gets into power, it just kind of ignores the people who helped it get there. Because although, abortion is still almost legal in some of the country, and although the movement has not gotten the big things that it wants, and although it itself feels betrayed and feels that it hasn't been rewarded justly for the role that it's played, the way our country works has changed in really significant and important ways. And I'm just going to talk about a couple of them briefly. A lot of people heard about the faith-based initiative and just assumed that it didn't really register that much. It just seemed like almost like a kind of campaign banality. But the faith-based initiative has resulted in the transfer of billions, with a B, billions of dollars, from secular social services to religious social services. Now, that in itself isn't necessarily problematic, because religious groups have gotten public money for a long time in this country. Catholic Charities, the Salvation Army, Lutheran Family and Children's Services, all of these people contract with the federal government and do often very, very important work. The difference is that it used to be that if you were contracting with the federal government, you had to abide by the 1956 Civil Rights Law, so that if you have a job that's being paid for with public money, you can't restrict it to only people of the right faith, and you can't proselytize with public money. Now, Bush has really, really changed that by executive order, kind of saying that these charities are no longer bound by the Civil Rights Law, by the 1956 Civil Rights Law, in the same way that churches, independent churches aren't. Churches are allowed to say we only hire Christians, mosques can say we only hire Muslims. I think most people think that's fine, but it's quite a different thing when that becomes a function of the federal government. So the result of this has been, first of all, the infusion of money into, in many cases, very small, untested congregations in which conversion is really the key to the kind of social services that they're providing. So that we're now funding faith-based drug treatment, where kind of becoming a born-again Christian is seen as the first step to recovery, and you study Bible verses, and that's kind of the foundation of the program. And the same goes for rehabilitation of prisoners, after-school programs, abstinence education, in which kind of teaching kids about Jesus Christ is considered the best way to prevent sexually transmitted diseases and teen pregnancy. Now, one of the stories in my book that I kind of find the most chilling, and also the most shocking in that it didn't get more attention at the time, is the way this has changed some established charities. And again, I say this again because this, I think, shows the way that America is changing in ways that maybe don't touch most people's lives